Vatican announced on Saturday that Cardinal Angelo Becciu has been indicted by the Vatican court and will be tried on charges of embezzlement and abuse of office. As we previously reported, Bashu resigned as head of the Congregation for the Cause of Saints and relinquished all rights and privileges as a cardinal back in September of 2020. He also served as substituto of General Affairs at the Secretariat of State. The Pope personally gave the required approval last week for Bashu to be indicted, according to a 487-page request. Bashu is the most senior Vatican official to be tried for financial crimes before a Vatican court. Here with in-depth analysis of all of this and more, Editor-in-Chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Royal. Robert, thanks for being here. As this financial scandal continues to unfold, what are your thoughts on the Bashu indictment? I mean, this is pretty spectacular, also considering how close Bashu is to the Holy Father.
Yeah, it was quite shocking when the Holy Father asked him to step down and then also removed from him his perquisites as a cardinal. And as you say, it's been something like 300 years since a cardinal has been indicted by the Vatican itself for financial irregularities. This seems to be a very serious prosecution. There are 10 people who have been accused, not only him, but there are 9 others. According to reports, the bill of crimes runs to something like 500 pages, so it seems to be quite detailed. It's going to be interesting to me to see how much the Vatican is going to allow to appear in public from its private files, from which apparently it drew this. It drew this indictment. One of the oddities about this group, though, is that 2 of the people who have been indicted, Tommaso De Ruzza, who's an Italian, and a Frenchman, René Brulard, these 2 were the president and the executive of an authority that oversaw the Vatican Bank, not the real estate deal in Sloane Street in London, that seems to be the center of this investigation. So why they're included, if you wanted to be a conspiracy theorist, maybe it's to be able to exonerate some people and then convict others, or maybe there's some strange connection between them, even though they were not formally part of the oversight board for this particular part of the Vatican's operations. And then on top of all of that, since Becciu was the sostituto, the second in command, under Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, there seems to be some connection that could go that high. It would be very remarkable if it were to touch even Cardinal Parolin. And then there is the fact of Edgar Peña Parra, who replaced Becciu, who himself seems to have some hand in these matters. So the trial is going to start on July 27th. There's a lot that we're going to be following when that begins.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I think, good on the Pope for the transparency here and exposing even a friend to the proper indictments, considering his role in all this. But look, that London property at the center of this, as you mentioned, it was purchased by the Secretariat of State in stages between 2014 and 2018 from Italian businessman Raffaele Mincione. Now, at the time, he was managing hundreds of millions of euros in the Secretariat's funds. Mincione will also stand trial on charges of embezzlement and fraud and abuse of office. Cardinal Parolin was Cardinal Bashu's boss when the deal was underway, and he authorized the purchase of this London property. Why hasn't he been indicted? Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that would be a real earthquake if the sitting Secretary of State at the Vatican were to be indicted by the Vatican itself. And I don't even know what mechanism would allow that to happen. I suppose the Holy Father himself would have to intervene at some point. Look, it's going to be a legitimate question when the evidence is being presented during this trial. How much Cardinal Parolin knew, and when did he know it, as we say here in Washington, right? The old joke. He could have signed off on it without knowing the specific details. The Secretary of State of the Vatican has wide responsibilities, of course. But it would be very odd for hundreds of millions of euros to go to a project without a Secretary of State, a responsible Secretary of State, looking very closely at what the deal entailed.
Yeah, well, this case could get very interesting. We'll keep our eyes on it. I want to move on to a potentially more important story on the Pope's health. And I want to bring in a doctor to join us, Bob. This past Sunday, Pope Francis underwent surgery to treat colon diverticulitis. Now, how serious is this condition, and what are the recovery concerns for a Pope who's 84 years old? Here now to discuss is General Surgeon at St. Joseph's Health Hospital in Syracuse, New York, a member of the Catholic Medical Association, Dr. Anthony Oliva. Doctor, what exactly is diverticulitis, and how severe a condition do you think this is? I know you're diagnosing from afar, but your thoughts?
Diverticulitis is a pretty common condition. It basically arises when you get some inflammation surrounding the colon, particularly most commonly the last part of the colon, just proximal or upstream from the rectum. It arises from people who develop these pouches in their colon. That's called diverticulosis. 60% of people around age 80 may have these pouches, but only 5% end up needing surgery. And in this case, it sounds like, based on what I've read in the news, he's likely had longstanding disease that's been chronic. I don't ever recall him being hospitalized for an acute attack, but over time, that can lead to hypertrophy or kind of stiffening of the colon wall, which can cause pain, cramping, difficulty in evacuating the bowels, and almost act like a partial obstruction. And when it gets to that stage, the only really good way to treat it is by surgery.
Yeah. And how severe and invasive is this surgery?
Well, typically they try and do it laparoscopically, or at least will start that way. And that involves smaller incisions, and you put in a camera inside the abdomen and remove the colon that way. But sometimes when the inflammation's severe, the tissue planes are obliterated, and it's very difficult to perform the operation laparoscopically because you lose the tactile sense. So you have to make a large incision so you can get your hands in there and palpate the structures. But in an 84-year-old, it is a risky proposition. Looking at the American College of Surgeons surgical risk calculator, risk of serious complication, the average risk is up to 15%. Any complication could be as high as 20%, including sepsis at 3.7. Death is pretty unusual. The average risk is only 0.6%, but infections 10%. So definitely you are concerned whenever you have an elderly patient undergoing this procedure, and that's assuming a healthy patient. I know the Pope has had some medical problems. I don't know exactly the full extent of them, but I know he does have some diminished lung capacity from a prior surgery.
The Pope was present at Sunday's Angelus last Sunday. He greeted people following the blessing, and the Vatican said the surgery was scheduled but was elective. However, there was no mention of it until Francis was already in the hospital. Your thoughts on the way the Vatican is sort of controlling the information about the Pope's health? Is that cause for concern?
It's really tough to know because this is a very serious condition. It would be hard to believe that he was delivering the Angelus and then all of a sudden he had to be admitted to the hospital for emergency surgery. That can happen where you require emergency surgery for diverticulitis, but typically it's in the setting of a perforation where you end up with peritonitis and you get deathly ill. If this has been something that's been ongoing, certainly it can be scheduled, but I think we see that everyone likes privacy when it comes to medical issues.
Yep. Doctor, the Vatican put out a statement this morning on the Pope's health. I want to read that in part. It says, His Holiness Pope Francis spent a quiet day, eating and moving unassisted. In the evening, he temporarily ran a temperature. The Holy Father is continuing with his planned treatment and eating by mouth. A fever is usually a sign of fighting off an infection, correct?
Yes, it can be. But looking at the time course from surgery, if he had the surgery on Sunday, the 4th, today's the 8th, so he's only 4 days out from surgery, it's pretty unusual to get a devastating complication that soon, especially if he's otherwise doing well. Commonly, people can have a little collapse of the lung bases called atelectasis from not deep breathing and coughing. More serious complications, usually the window you see that could be 1 to 2 weeks, but certainly you never want to blow off a fever or minimize it, because that can be an indicator of a more serious underlying problem, because this was a very complicated operation he underwent.
Yeah. Yeah, and particularly for someone his age. What do you make of that language that he's eating by mouth? They reinforced that twice in the statement. That must be a shake, right? He can't be processing hard foods at this point.
Sometimes you can. It depends on how quickly his bowel function recovers and the extent of the surgery they had to do, and whether they, removed his colon, and then they were able to. When you remove a segment of colon, you try and connect the two ends. Typically, what he had, it would involve bringing the colon down and connecting it to the rectum, which requires a little more time to heal. But I don't know the full extent of the operation he had, or if he had anything else done. But once bowel function returns, moving your bowels or passing flatus, passing gas, then typically it's someone's otherwise doing well, it's safe to feed them.
Okay, final question. In a blog post this week, a Vatican insider, Luis Badia, who edits something called Il Sismografo, said that journalists and commentators are not doing the Pope any favors when they downplay the seriousness of this illness and the surgery, writing that, quote, the Holy Father will certainly return to the Vatican to resume his path in the footsteps of Peter, but he will never be the same again, end quote. Your reaction?
I don't know if that's entirely true. One thing I can say from taking care of elderly patients, that sometimes it can take them several weeks to months to get back to their baseline where they were functioning before surgery. But this is not, this is an illness that's been treated. It shouldn't come back. He should make a full recovery. It may take him some time. I know he occasionally is really limited by his sciatica. I'm not sure what his lung function's like, and he is 84, but I have no reason to think that if he does well from the surgery, he shouldn't make a complete recovery and be able to travel in the fall.
Yeah, that's my sense too. Pope Francis was expected to travel to Hungary and Slovakia in September. Do you think he'll be able to make it, or is that a bit too ambitious?
I think there's a good chance he can make it if he has an uneventful recovery without any complications. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't be able to travel.
Okay, Dr. Anthony Oliva, I thank you for the perspective there, the medical insight. It's, I think, important as we look at what's happening. Bob, I want to return to you. Pope Francis has indicated several times that he would resign the papacy if the time ever came where he thought he should. In an interview in 2015 with Mexican news outlet Televisa, Francis had this to say when asked about his papacy and if he would consider resigning like his predecessor. And he says here, I have the feeling that my pontificate will be brief, 4 or 5 years. I do not know, even 2 or 3. Benedict should not be considered an exception, but an institution. Maybe he will be the only time for a long time. Maybe he will not be. But an institutional door has been opened. In August of 2014, Pope Francis told reporters about retiring, I think that a Pope Emeritus should not be an exception. You can ask me, what if one day you don't feel prepared to go on? I would do the same. I would do the same. And then he reiterated that during a homily in 2018. Bob, your take on all of this. Where do you see the Pope's health here? And do you think he would resign if he's facing complications?
Well, I think Dr. Oliva was right to be cautious about this. A lot of people are jumping to conclusions. That article in Il Sismografo, it's an odd word in Italian, Sismografo, says he'll never be the same. Today's LA Times is talking about he's in the hospital, but he's as much in charge as ever. There's a big headline. And so people who like him want to make, they want to believe that he's well. People who may have some criticisms, just believe that this is the beginning of the end, or they want to think that at least. My guess is we'll know fairly shortly if this is going along well or not. But the bigger question here, and this is something that several papacies now have faced, because we're all living longer. When people are living into their 80s and 90s, and no one thought that Benedict would live as long as he had. Just, when he resigned, he was really exhausted. The Swiss guards were telling me he could barely walk. They had to wheel him down the main aisle at St. Peter's for masses. And yet, once the pressure of the papacy was off him, he survived a long time. The questions now are going to be, and I don't think it's only a matter of would Pope Francis himself decide to resign? That day may come, and he seems to me to be level-headed enough that perhaps that would happen. The other question is, suppose he's incapacitated and he's unable to resign, or as sometimes happens with people who start to get dementia, gets very stubborn about things, and so who then would be able to make a decision? There needs to be. I think we've started to move toward that with the papacy of John Paul II, who himself had a tumor removed from his colon, and then of course had Parkinson's and a hip problem. I think we're going to have to face this problem as a church, what to do if a pope becomes incapacitated. Is there a committee, or is there a particular individual who decides that he's no longer capable of carrying out the functions and therefore a new pope has to be elected? This is going to come to a head in the church, and I think we'll see that probably sooner rather than later.
Yeah, the Vatican has been very guarded about information about the Pope's surgery. I mean, they announced it after he was already undergoing the surgery. This is sort of, though, the common playbook, the default position of the Vatican press operation, right?
Yeah, I have to commend them. At least there were no internal contradictions. At least the stories that we got, you and I have covered these things for a long time, Raymond, and we know that sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. This seemed to be fairly disciplined. It's sort of typical of the way that the Vatican handles these questions, that the Pope has the Angelus, and then sometime later all of a sudden pops up in a hospital where he's got a major operation going on. But I don't know why they do this. They keep talking about wanting to be transparent, and to be transparent in the modern world means to be much more forthcoming. It was entirely possible for them to have announced on Friday or Saturday that the Pope has to go in for this procedure. He's going to do the Angelus tomorrow. He's not on death's door. He's going to do that, and he's going to go over to the hospital. But for some reason, they like to hold this information very, very tight.
Bob, I have to move on, but we certainly pray for the Pope's recovery, and I know all of our viewers join us in that. I have to ask you about a recent op-ed in The Hill this week by John Kenneth White, former co-chair of Catholics for Biden. In his op-ed, he writes that the bishop's call for Eucharistic coherence is a first-class fiasco of their own making. White goes on to say that one of the reasons forcing the bishops to deal with this topic, forcing them in the first place, is, quote, the proliferation of conservative Catholic publications, such as First Things, and websites that include the National Catholic Register and LifeSite News. Like the bishops, these publications make abortion their preeminent priority. Besides these websites, EWTN, the Catholic cable channel, has become the go-to network for conservative Catholics. Raymond Arroyo's nightly The World Over program features his papal posse that is highly critical of Pope Francis. Okay, first of all, we are not critical of Pope Francis. We take his papacy seriously and analyze it as it comes. Secondly, we are not on nightly, though I'm delighted that our imprint is so large that it feels like it's nightly. And thirdly, I love how he charges the bishops and us with partisanship. Who's the person here who worked for the political campaign? That would be you, Professor John Kenneth White, Catholics for Biden board member, also a CUA professor. Bob, your thoughts?
Well, what makes me laugh about this, other than this impression that we're some sort of 900-pound gorilla that is able to pressure our bishops into doing something, is that the bishops have been virtually in lockstep with the Democrats on immigration, on poverty, on climate, all these issues. And it's not we who force their hands. It is the fact that we have a president claiming to be a devout Catholic who has been for years pushing issues like abortion, which is not, by the way, a question of the faith. It is a question of the natural law. It is not about sex. It is about violence. It's about killing human beings in the womb. And as for whether this is a fast-moving fiasco, the bishops, of course, have every possibility of creating a fiasco out of this. But like other people looking at the Pope and wanting it to be one thing or another, I think people like this, people like Professor White, would love this to become a fiasco. We'll see if it develops into one. But as far as I can see right now, these attacks are coming out precisely because this is a very serious critique that's being put to Catholic politicians out there in the public square. I said at our last posse that if the bishops only produce words and no action, well, then the words are nice, but still we haven't gotten anything further along. What I'd like to suggest they do is if they take a figure like Joe Biden or like Nancy Pelosi and speak to them privately, and they still persist in this stubborn refusal to enforce the natural law and follow church teaching, that they make a public statement that they have warned these people not to take communion. You know, you often talk about Archbishop Rummel, who excommunicated people in New Orleans who were standing in the way of segregation and were racists. And that was real action taken by an American Catholic bishop to draw a line in the sand because we believe in certain things. I think the same sort of thing has to happen. It may be impossible to forbid these people from coming forward, but I think that it should at least be told, it should at least be said publicly that they've been told not to come forward, because otherwise our bishops show themselves to be toothless. The church cannot even enforce its own discipline on Catholics.
Yeah, well, and you've nailed it right there. The church's own discipline. It doesn't come from a website or a political party. This is canon law. It's in the canon law. The church, this is the church's belief and doctrine and what it means to be in communion. So it doesn't matter whether I'm saying it or somebody else is saying it or that guy over there saying it. That's all just atmospherics. The canon law requires that one live in continuity with this body of teaching to be considered in communion. That's all. It's very simple. In response to the USCCB's decision to move forward on creating a draft document on Eucharistic coherence, President Biden's parish, Holy Trinity in Washington, D.C., released this statement. Holy Trinity Catholic Church will not deny the Eucharist to persons presenting themselves to receive it. As the Holy Trinity Parish Council, we stand with our Archbishop, Cardinal Wilton Gregory, concerning the issues surrounding offering the Eucharist to American politicians. The recent vote has caused considerable desolation among our parishioners, as well as Roman Catholics throughout the nation. Desolation among the parishioners, Bob. As we've said repeatedly, there will be nothing new in the document that's not already widely understood. Do you expect we'll see more of this from parishes across the country, or parish councils?
Well, probably, but you know, the Biden parish here in Washington is well known to be a liberal parish. I don't want to accuse anybody of heresy, but liberal parishes, you know, tend to go their own way on a variety of different issues. Many of them, I have the suspicion, don't even believe in the real. A lot of people in those parishes don't even believe in the real presence. We have statistics to support that. I would actually like to see the opposite. I would like to see bishops across the country do what I just mentioned, and that is tell politicians privately at first, counsel them, you know, be pastoral. But if they persist in public scandal, I mean, that's the thing that Canon 915 in particular points toward. It. This isn't just you or I privately having an opinion that may be skewed away from Catholic truth. It's being a public figure who's causing scandal and is misleading people about what the faith is. So I would like to see bishops individually, because they can only do this individually within their own diocese, come out and then point to particular people who've been warned. My friend Cardinal George in Chicago, before he died, had Dick Durbin, Senator Dick Durbin, in multiple times. I used to tell him that he ought to take further steps, and for various reasons he couldn't or wouldn't. But I think the time now is to move beyond this sort of stalemate that we've had, where we say the right things, but there's no further follow through. We need what one of my writers at the Catholic thing, Father Timothy Vavrick, called pastoral coherence to correspond with the Eucharistic coherence.
No, we've reached a point where, though people say you're weaponizing and politicizing the Eucharist, what's actually happening is people are trying to frame this as politics and as partisanship, as a way of restraining the church law and what's required by the church. So we'll see how this plays out. But It's going to be quite a battle. Pope Francis has agreed to meet with indigenous leaders later this year in Canada, Bob, to discuss a possible visit to apologize for the Church's role in operating residential schools. Now, these church-run institutions were found to have abused and forcibly assimilated generations of indigenous children. In the last few weeks, at least 5 Catholic churches in Canada have been set ablaze and vandalized in retaliation. Canada's First Nations leaders have explicitly condemned the violence, but not a word from the Vatican. What's going on here, Bob?
Well, look, this is a complicated situation. These so-called residential schools in Canada were actually founded by the Canadian government. And the Canadian government asked not only the Catholic Church, we keep hearing about the Catholic Church, but we're kind of used to, being the whipping boy for things like this. But it was not only the Catholic Church, it was Protestant denominations. Canada is other than certain parts of Canada, is very Protestant. They too were running these residential schools. Now, there have been what are being called mass graves found around these various schools. Those schools operated for decades upon decades. We don't know why those children died. Was there some abuse? No doubt there probably was. Was there probably some improper attempt to assimilate? But then again, assimilation means bringing people into the mainstream. You can still have your indigenous culture. And by the way, many of the people in those churches that were burned are still indigenous people who went to those residential schools.
Right.
I've talked with some of my Canadian friends, and they say there's been no investigation into how these children died, what this actually means. What this really is, in my judgment, is it's a rush to blame this on the Catholic Church, spare the Canadian government before we know anything at all. It could be that these Catholic orders were at fault, but we don't know that for a fact. This is sort of painting, as the Roman historian Tacitus did, that the Christians are the enemy of the human race because we don't go along with what the rest of the culture is doing. I think that it's an outrage. Some of my friends in Canada tell me it's more actually Antifa types rather than native indigenous peoples who are burning these churches. And so we want to, I noticed that Pope Francis has been a little slow to react to this idea that that the church should apologize. And I assume that's because he's getting information that we need to wait until there's some investigations done. There could be criminality here. It could be something much less serious than that.
Bob, we'll leave it there. Thank you, as always, for your commentary. Robert Royal's ongoing commentary can be found at thecatholicthing.org. Thanks, Bob.